right, before we get started, I thought I'd start with an introduction. I'm Carla Roncato. I'm the Vice President of Identity here at WatchGuard. I've been working in the field of identity for about 30 years. Predominantly, my experience is with large enterprise and government, and I've worked at companies such as Cognizant, which is a large global IT service provider, as well as the Intel Corporation, where I worked in the platform security division. I was also a member of the McAfee team, which was actually acquired by Intel Security at the time. And I also had the benefit of working at Microsoft for a number of years, including in the Active Directory team and the identity division. I'm also a member of the OpenID Foundation and an evangelist there, and was part of the team that helped develop the foundation back in 2007. All right, with that, let's get started. So in this session today, you will learn about strategies for enabling a modern zero trust information security strategy, how identity threat detection and response fits into your environment, and an example of top use cases for on-premises and cloud environments that we're working on here at WatchGuard. So with that, let's get started. So before we go into the actual session, I wanted to provide an overview about WatchGuard as a company so that I can put this topic into context of what we do here. So we have a vision here at WatchGuard to build something called the Unified Security Platform. It's designed for managed service providers, or MSPs, and it's intended to help medium and small businesses get the best enterprise-grade security available from a managed service provider. So we are 100% serving MSPs, and they then serve end user clients like yourself in mid-market as well as SMB. So the WatchGuard platform focuses on these 5 capabilities that you see on the right-hand side: clarity and control, which is WatchGuard's central platform, WatchGuard Cloud, our central security policy, threat remediation, visibility, and reporting to streamline security. And then you have the 4 product lines across the complete security stack, which includes network security, secure Wi-Fi, endpoint security, and today's topic, identity security. So today we exclusively focus on workforce identities with our 2 product lines, Authpoint MFA and Authpoint Total Identity Security. At the next layer, we have an area called shared knowledge, which has both our XDR solution, or extended detection and response, called ThreatSync. And on the other side, we have a capability called the identity framework. This is an enabling technology that creates consistency across the entire stack of our technology, as well as up and down the stack from the cloud perspective. On the 4th layer here around operational alignment, we provide 2 different categories here. We're an API-driven platform first, and we have hundreds of integrations across other third-party solutions as well as within our own products, as well as operational efficiency around the way you may want to consume our services as an end user customer. So that could mean term licenses, monthly subscriptions, points programs, different ways that you can consume our products and services that best suit your business and operating model. And then last but not least, we're automation driven. So underpinning this platform is both a business and security automation built in to simplify every aspect of your security consumption, delivery, and management. So with that, let's get started. We're going to cover identity security, a little bit about the identity framework and its role, as well as ThreatSync in an example towards the end of this talk. All right, before we get started, let's ask the polling question for the audience around what you think zero trust is. So here you have longer descriptions than you will see in the poll questions, but they're in the exact same order. So what we have here is an example of 5 different ways of answering the question. Is it a stricter form of cloud security posture management? Is it a technology solution you buy and integrate into your existing security infrastructure? Is it segmentation software that enables central visibility and control of security policies across heterogeneous environments? Or is it a shift away from a network-centric access control of inherited or implicit trust to a never trust and always verify model? Or is it all of the above? We're going to take a moment and give folks time to answer the polling question.
I'll give everyone about 20 more seconds. Okay, we're about 75% of the vote. We'd really love if we could get 80% of people here to give their answers. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results.
Thank you. All right, I don't see the results.
So it looks like 64% of people said all of the above. 36% said a shift from implicit trust to never trust, always verify. No one said any of the other options.
Great, perfect. So this will be a really informative session. So the correct answer was the 36% that answered a shift away from network-centric access control. So that is the well-known or mostly defined description of zero trust in the market today. We're going to talk about in the next section here a more modern interpretation that has recently come about. All right, so the broad theme of zero trust is a reduction of implicit trust. However, Forrester recently updated their definition of modern zero trust. As a model for information security, zero trust is an information security model that denies access to applications and data by default. Threat prevention is achieved only by granting access to networks and workloads utilizing policy informed by continuous contextual risk-based verification across users and their associated devices. That's a mouthful, but it gets simpler. So zero trust advocates three core principles. All entities are untrusted by default, which is what we talked about in the earlier example. Least privileged access is enforced, so only the minimum number of privileges or access at any given time. So rather than static and standing privileges, just-in-time privileges, for example. And comprehensive security monitoring is implemented. Now that is brand new for the definition of zero trust as of 2023 out of Forrester. So to sum it up, the way they describe it in bullet points is deny by default, access by policy only. It applies to data, workloads, users, and devices, least privilege access, security monitoring, and risk-based verification. So keeping that in mind, we're now going to talk about what the definition of identity threat detection is. So ITDR is not a product, although it follows the trend of MDR, Managed Detection and Response, NDR, Network Detection and Response, and XDR, Extended Detection and Response. And it took a while for us to get here, but eventually Identity Threat Detection and Response is now a term that Gartner has defined for the community of identity security vendors that exist. So again, while today it's not a category, it could become one in the future, as you've heard in a number of these other examples. But what it really is a security discipline that encompasses threat intelligence, best practices, knowledge base, and processes to protect identity systems. So ITDR works by implementing these detection mechanisms, investigating suspect posture changes and activities, and responding to attacks to restore the integrity of these identity infrastructures, whether they be on premises or in the cloud, is not relevant. It can be hybrid, it can be on-prem, it can be cloud, or it can be a combination of all of those things. So identity first security is a foundational aspect of zero trust. So here's where you're seeing the connection between what ITDR aims to deliver as a security discipline associated to zero trust as an information security model. So it demands that only the approved end users, devices, and services should have access to systems. So with that, we're very fortunate as well that identity-based indicators of compromise or indicators of attack, or TTPs, which are techniques and tactics and procedures, are well defined in the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So the MITRE ATT&CK matrix is an example of a knowledge base, and that is different from the tools that we're about to talk about. But before we get into that, let's take our next poll. All right, so What types of identity access tools do you use today or your organizations that you support as a managed service provider? Please check all that apply.
We're getting a good mix of results, Carla.
Great, glad to hear it.
Active Directory and Cloud Directory service has remained in the lead with a close second of Password Manager.
Oh, great. I didn't expect that.
We're at 74% voted, so we'd really appreciate it if those who haven't voted yet would answer and let us know the types of identity and access tools you use. Okay, I'll give everyone about 15 more seconds before closing the poll. Okay, poll is closed. So Carla, it looks like 88% of those who answered are Active Directory and Cloud Directory service users. 56% have Access Management Federation SSO. 43% answered Privilege Access Management, and 68% answered Password Manager.
All right, that's fascinating. I expected MFA to be pretty high up there, so this is going to be a really interesting conversation. I'm not surprised at all to see the Active Directory and Cloud Directory, which could be Azure Active Directory, it could be Active Directory services. Having worked at Microsoft, very, very widespread install base for Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. We all know that they're probably the world's largest identity provider, so not at all surprised by these results. A little bit surprised not to see MFA high up there on the list as well, given the risk factors with credentials. But let's get into how the impact of these tools and the relationship to Zero Trust and ITDR works. And this will help bring it together from a little bit more of an explanation. All right, so in terms of how Zero Trust plus, the important point here is plus ITDR addresses the in-between. So what you see here in an example of these blocks are the technologies and tools we just talked about in the poll, and a few others, including in this example, entitlement management, certificate management, as an example. So each one of these tools is essentially purpose-built. It's built with workflow management and user enablement for achieving productivity and access to systems and things. Essentially, each one of these tools, like for example, identity management, relies on the Active Directory as its source, but in an identity or user management system, which is often referred to as an IGA, Identity Governance and Administration tool, it's responsible for provisioning and deprovisioning users, so the joiner, mover, leaver workflows that exist. And in access management, you find those tech tools and technologies around web access management, single sign-on. You might see some MFA in there as well. And so these are really around creating a more seamless experience once accounts have been provisioned for users and subscriptions, for example, to applications are accomplished. So each one of these workflow tools is able to, through interoperability, communicate with each other for the purpose that they have, which is something like provisioning or something like granting certain levels of access rights. But what they aren't good at doing, they're still siloed work tools of monitoring or detecting or investigating if those systems and tools are being misused or are in some way compromised. So one of the things you see here is the word management a lot. Identity management, access management, privilege management, password management, certificate management. It's really important to know that identity solutions and tools are management tools and intended for compliance reasons and for granting access. It's not a set of tools that's intended for security monitoring, security operations, threat detection. And so as a result, it makes a lot more sense to create an ITDR type of approach, again, a security discipline, in order to leverage these tools in a way that actually helps you understand how they are being misused or are used in an unauthorized way. So some of the questions I pose are, would you know if an Active Directory domain controller is rogue or under unauthorized control? If someone can gain access to a Windows Server environment, they can promote a machine to becoming a domain controller if they have that level of privilege, and you might not be aware that that has occurred in your environment. And this is an example of a threat that exists in the MITRE matrix, for example. Also, it could be a symptom of how long it might take you to discover something. For example, if you are using SAML for single sign-on experience, would you be able to tell if someone had tampered with the token lifetime? So the issuing of the SAML tokens, for example, has no expiration date. So they live unlimitedly, and which means they can be used without any controls or any session expiry. Tampering with tokens is surprisingly not that difficult to do given the number of tools available for the adversaries. Also, an example of, are you able to tell what percentage of employees reuse the same passwords across systems? So not everything is enabled by SSO. There are some shadow IT apps, but also some reasons why you still continue to use password-only access to applications. But what often happens is employees reuse the same passwords across many different subscriptions, or even mixed use passwords that they use in personal use, they'll use in their company setting, and vice versa. Very difficult to determine how they're setting these passwords, especially given that you're not really managing a lot of these applications. You're subscribing, but you're not necessarily managing them. Or what about administrators that share static or persistent privilege level credentials? These are often not changed or rotated very often. They may not even be associated to an individual. They're literally called admin accounts. They share the same passwords, and that secret is stored somewhere on a sticky note or an Excel spreadsheet that gets used by those admins. You might be using a password manager to share those credentials as well. But again, those credentials are static, meaning they're not really changing very often, or they're not changing at all because they're system level type accounts. And that makes them very vulnerable to being misused or abused by an adversary, for example. Another example is when an admin maybe disables MFA that they use, and they're doing some kind of remote activity, or they're doing some kind of service on a particular resource. And so it may be for a brief exception period, but there may be no automation to re-enable it after they've completed a particular task. So these types of examples describe sort of the problem set that happens when these tools are being used, but they're not being used in a way that was intended, for example. So evicting a bad actor is hard. Attackers know the easiest path to compromising an organization is through human error. The new Verizon data breach report came out just this past month, and credentials continue to be the top source of data breaches globally. The new number is around 74%, which is an 8-point improvement from the previous year, which had always hovered above the 80%. It tells us that maybe MFA is working, but it's still not going further enough to provide protections against human social engineering and compromised credentials. So the big piece here is that what the adversary can do after one of these techniques works is the in between, and it's really where the damage starts. The reality is that hackers don't really break in, they log in. So your first line of defense for information security is zero trust, where all entities are untrusted by default, least privilege is enforced, and access is only by risk-based verification policies. Your second line of defense, essentially from an identity security perspective, is ITDR, where all identities, devices, and the identity infrastructure are monitored with continuous event collection, signal correlation, risk scoring, and assessment of these IOCs or IOAs. All right, so with that, we're going to provide a real-world example here at WatchGuard. So we're looking at new ways that our new and existing products can provide ITDR capabilities across our product lines. So earlier I mentioned network security and endpoint security and secure Wi-Fi, and then of course, identity security. So in this example, I have a managed service provider at the top that provides an ITDR service as part of their portfolio. And what you see on the left is all of our employees in this example are already using our Authpoint Total Identity Security product, which combines MFA with SSO, so you can have that single sign-on experience, as well as a password manager. And that brings multiple different product lines that you saw as discrete purpose-built together to help consolidate your environment first and foremost. So that's better TCO for everyone, but it's also one solution, one app, all in one. Secondly, what you see is that the service provider has enabled the dark web monitoring, credential monitoring service that comes with the product. So with Total Identity Security, as an example, it comes with that dark web monitoring service, and that is an additional level of protection that your managed service providers can provide end customers and end users. So if and when a credential is discovered in a data breach that is being monitored, meaning the domain name, that intelligence is shared with our threat sync service. That's part of the platform. That's something that our managed service providers can turn on and provide that kind of threat intelligence monitoring service. At the same time, you'll see in the third area here, the managed service providers administrators, as well as the end user that's impacted, is notified in their own interfaces that a credential was discovered in this dark web breach. So that gives you time to immediately remediate the situation for yourselves from a self-service perspective if you are notified early enough and you see that notification, of course. So while that's happening as well, our service with ThreatSync is continuing to collect and correlate and determining the risk score based on how this credential is in use. So whether you're logged into multiple machines, whether this individual is logged into multiple different ways or different connections. So that can mean VPN connection, that could mean through a browser, that could mean the PC itself, for example, or it could mean an SSO session through a browser as well. So a couple of the things that we're really excited about in this combination of bringing the intelligence across the stack of our products into our ThreatSync capability is that we can start to create these automated ITDR actions. And these would be configurable. So it's not like we're telling you what you need to remediate or the degree with which you need to remediate. But these are examples of automations that can be programmed and configured in order to provide you the best defense as soon as you learn something from the ThreatSync engine, essentially. So a couple of examples here, they're really valuable, include things like locking or disabling the user in Active Directory, as an example, which would help prevent new authentication attempts, which with that particularly compromised credential. It can just as easily be Azure AD or any other cloud directory service that you're using, because again, it's a signal. You could log the user out of every session everywhere. In the case of WatchGuard, we would have the ability to reduce the attack surface and the impact radius that compromised credential. So again, logging the user off immediately from the browser, from a VPN session, from an SSO session, or the PC entirely using the integrations with our endpoint universal agent, for example. And the user doesn't have to be involved in that example. The machine itself could help self-remediate. You can also force a password change by the end user to mitigate account takeover attempts. So again, before that dark web credential is purchased and used against you, you can immediately take action before anything happens. So helps to mitigate that ATO. You can also require or enable multi-factor authentication. So one of the best defenses against password only is doing verification. So with our Authpoint line of products, verifying that the user is in fact the person who requested the access rather than someone else who has acquired the credential through a breach, a database breach, is one of the best defenses. It doesn't solve the password problem, but it at least ensures that the individual behind the keyboard making the request for access is in fact the user. And so that's one of the best mechanisms if you're going to continue to use passwords in your environment, is to add that extra layer of verification. And we offer multiple ways of doing that in both an online and offline mode. The most popular is, of course, push notifications because they're easy and quick to approve or deny. And all of that, again, is captured as part of the telemetry and eventing that we collect, and in order to provide the visibility of again, whether we're denying or approving access requests. You can also quarantine the endpoint. This is a unique way of temporarily suspending what it can do in order to clean up cached credentials that persist. One of the beautiful things about offline work is that you can still be productive and unlock your devices, but cached credentials also become problematic in a scenario where that cached credential is also part of the compromised scenario. So you can run a binary that collects the endpoint telemetry at the same time as forensics. Lightweight, quick, and really, again, doesn't require that the user is participating or interacting with the device at all. You can also set a policy to deny all future attempts to use or set the password based on weak, reused, or known compromised passwords. So again, just because this was reported last year, people forget and then try to reuse a password that was familiar to them, bring it back into the environment. It allows you to prevent the reuse of a policy by policy of a previously known or reused password, for example. And then last but not least, thinking about this in a collective way, especially if you're managing many clients and many tenants, how to generate insights on past and future attempts. So looking maybe 30 days back to see, did they try this before we discovered it in this particular dark web monitoring breach? Or, were they already laying off the land, as we say? Had an adversary already breached your environment, and now you actually have to go through the process of evicting them? So it could give you some insights into activities that occurred before this was discovered. And then also you can continue to monitor it for, say, 30 or more days, just giving you an example here, further out into the future, and how you might want to look at whether or not there's additional reuse or attempts against that credential, because maybe it was a shared admin account and you weren't able to necessarily determine how many users had access to that shared credential when it became compromised, as an example. All right, so with that example, we have quite a bit of time left. So I'd love to start taking some questions from the audience. And I know we probably had a couple that first came, but before that, I just wanted to encourage you to download this No Excuses to Delaying Enabling Zero Trust with MFA. It's a 2-pager that talks about a very informal interview I had with IDC, and it really speaks to the role of MSPs in enabling zero trust, and in particular helping improve identity security with MFA. So that's a free asset for you to download. No gated, you don't have to fill out a form. You'll immediately get access to it. But let's jump into Q&A.
Hey, Carla, we do have a few questions from the audience. I think one related to password management. Is YubiKey considered password management?
So YubiKey are predominantly hardware keys, and so they have a couple of varieties. They have hardware keys that are FIDO compliant, which is a new protocol that is supported by all the major manufacturers. So Microsoft from an operating system, also from a hardware perspective, Apple both on Mac, and they work, the FIDO keys work on iOS as well, and they work with Chrome, Chromebooks, as well as all other Google products and Android. So that's one example of a very ubiquitous way for YubiKeys to work with all the major manufacturers, which is a positive, but it is an expensive token. Actually, I have one right here. It is an expensive token, so it does cost money, and it's something that you have to possess. So one of the things about MFA is it's proof of possession, or something you have. So in addition to having a mobile device, you would also have to be in possession of that hardware token. So they're excellent, and they're especially valuable in administrative situations where you really want that proof of possession to be more than a mobile device, for example. So That's just one of the examples, but it is definitely not a password management solution. In fact, it's passwordless completely. There's no password associated to a YubiKey at all. There may be a PIN to unlock, but more and more they're actually touch, so they're biometric. So there's absolutely no password, and there's no password primitives, and there's no rollback to passwords related to YubiKey. Great question, though.
Thank you, Carla. We also have from earlier in your presentation, we got a question about MITRE ATT&CK. If you could elaborate more on the MITRE framework.
Absolutely, I'd love to. I actually threw a slide in here in case it came up because the MITRE ATT&CK matrix is incredibly dense. And so I've thrown up an example here, and I'm really glad to talk about this a little bit. So again, knowledge base that helps us as security professionals in the ecosystem focus on uniformly describing a particular technique or tactic that an adversary may use, and these are the most common ones. Hopefully you can see that I've highlighted a few in red, quite a few in red, that are identity based. And so you can see from left to right, it starts with reconnaissance, which again can be on or offline mode. It really depends on the adversary and how badly they financially want to breach your environment, all the way to the end in impact. And I haven't even highlighted, there's still more over to the right that I hadn't even highlighted just for the sake of this conversation. I've covered the major ones that are earlier on in the attack chain, if you will. So beginning with phishing, of course, phishing, again, social engineering is one of the primary and easiest ways for an adversary to approach any organization or any individual, and it usually takes around 4 techniques or attempts for them to finally get to where they want to go once they're successful with that first technique. And as you move across, you can see they're developing resource development, trying to do that collection and create resources that they can reuse, which would make them difficult to evict. So compromising accounts, but also establishing accounts that are unnoticed. And again, these tools that I've described don't know the intent of the person who created and established an account. And so that's what makes this such a dangerous environment for these tools that are all about enabling access to be abused and misused. As you move towards initial access, this is sort of that brute force, using all the tools and techniques that are available in the dark web from a tools perspective, bots, rainbow tables, dictionary attacks. These are ways in which these adversaries have the upper hand in many ways, especially against password-only solutions and environments. As you move across, you can see account manipulation and browser extensions. A lot of browsers, actually all the browsers pretty much, have password managers built into them, as well as extensions that can be exploited, exploiting the clipboard. There's a number of different examples of stealing cookie sessions for replay. So again, lots of ways in which the browser becomes part of the problem, but it's also, again, part of the world that we work in. Abusing valid accounts. Again, you don't have to create or establish an account if you can get away with using one that has validity. Moving across here, there's an entire category of abuse of escalation, which we see consistently happening. Once an adversary gets in, they acquire more privilege, they elevate, they escalate, they move laterally, and that's where you start to see more command and control behavior, where they can stand up infrastructure, they can convert a server to becoming a domain controller, they can deploy a federation if they have, are able to gain enterprise level access. And worse off, they can start on-prem and then take over your cloud and Azure portals, your AWS administration, because again, it's those privileges that is giving them those permissions to do so. And then there's an entire section just on credential access, which is specifically all these different techniques that occur even after they've gained access. So continuing to develop, continuing to intercept MFA tools that can trick users into approving pushes, not even through phishing, but through sending erroneous push notifications to test and see if they can get people to approve things. And then that way they know at the time that they're ready to deploy their attack. So again, it's not always at their first attempt, is the end attempt. It's that they're practicing as well to see what happens. So these examples are significant, but what's fortunate is the way we're incorporating this into our technology stack and into ThreatSync is you don't have to know all the nitty-gritty details. You'll be able to see the risk scoring associated to an IOC like this, and we'll be able to provide that remediation, because at the end of the day, the thing that matters is that we've offered you a way to either do manual or automated remediation.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Carla. So I have several that are mentioning LastPass breach, and if you have a password manager and you become vulnerable to an incident. So I think I'm going to paraphrase just to combine just few members that are asking similar questions. And just generally speaking, if you have a password manager, I guess considerations in terms of vulnerabilities, but also one of them did have the question about insurance, like if it happens, like do we have any information about password management related breaches and insurance coverage?
That's a great question. So I'll start with the first one. I won't necessarily, talk about the specific things that happened with LastPass. It's well documented in the press, but one of the things we benefited from, which I hate to say that, but learning is learning, and what we understood now is that first of all, the way the password derivation algorithm was working led to the part of the risk. So the fact that there was a significant breach, the fact that the organization could not detect that they had not evicted the bad actor. Again, I've kind of mentioned why that's so difficult. And the fact that they had access to the keys once they breached that environment, and it took them some time to get there, and actually, 6 months in waiting, as they say, living off the land a little bit. The thing that was most noticeable about the way the password manager was built was that it was using an older cryptographic library and an older way of doing password generation than what we would see today in a more modern one. So that particular approach is not the approach that we took here at WatchGuard with our password manager. We're using a more modern cryptographic library called Argon 2 ID, and the I and the D actually mean something important. It helps prevent things like side channel attacks and GPU cracking, for example. So it's more resistant to those behavior, but also the algorithm itself is a much stronger algorithm when it does the password generation. So from a password vault perspective, as well as the password generator that's in the tool, the product is built in a way that is entirely different than LastPass. And so that is one of the ways in which we're more confident that its development, even if for some reason there was a way to breach, and the infrastructure associated with delivering these capabilities, they would not be able to get access to the blob, essentially, that involves the encryption, because only you are the possessor of the private key associated to your vault. That is not stored anywhere. So if you forget that password to the vault, and you don't have the recovery key, which only you possess, there is no way for someone to decrypt it, or it would take an immense amount of effort on behalf in order to put a lot of compute power, because remember I mentioned the GPU cracking resistance. It would take a lot of compute power to breach. So they'd either really want to breach you specifically or really want to breach the vendor. This example suggests to me that this adversary really wanted to breach the vendor. I don't know that their end goal, we'll never know their end goal, was to breach the end users, the millions of subscribers. So my suggestion would be, despite it's your decision, of course, but I would strongly consider a different password manager, ideally off-point total identity security, because of the fact that there's really no way for the company to determine that they've actually been able to make these changes that they need to, and prevent this kind of attack from happening again or persisting. Again, the adversaries have a head start, and it's not clear to me that they've evicted them or that they've actually gained control back or rotated the keys. But we also don't know that the end goal was to actually exploit the subscriber base. We just know it was definitely damaging to the company themselves. Can you remind me of the second part of that question?
It was cyber insurance. So what can we say?
Thank you. Cyber
Yeah.
insurance is such a fascinating topic. So first of all, password managers in themselves aren't necessarily within the scope of cyber insurance. So access control and the appropriate level of auditability and tools is, so it's not that necessarily password managers are. However, MFA is named as a requirement. So I just want to mention that MFA is a requirement for cybersecurity insurance. And we've done some research in this area, and we've also benefited from some research that exists out in the industry. And Sam and I attended the European Identity Conference in Berlin just a month ago. And we learned a lot about the fact that insurance, the initial insurance for, let's just say, the United States is around somewhere between $1,500 to $2,500 for a small, medium-sized business. You get about $1 million in liability coverage, and you have about a $10,000 deductible you'd have to pay. Cyber insurance is not a mitigation for not implementing these security controls, whether it's access control, as we've described, MFA. It is not instead of, it's in addition to, in the event that something happens. And so what we learned through some of the research and some of the talks that we heard was it's mostly a checklist today. There isn't a lot of verification done by the insurers when they grant you that initial policy. Often the policies don't cover situations that often are the intent of why the adversary is pursuing you. So as an example, it won't cover the technique of ransomware if you don't have it included in the policy. So you experience a breach, and if it turns out under the investigation that ransomware was the cause and the technique, your policy, unless it states ransomware, you actually may not have coverage. So it's really important that you read the fine print and that you think about the exact techniques, believe it or not, that you believe you need coverage for. Additionally, once you've had a breach, or if you've experienced one, which it turns out a significant number have, reinsurance becomes very difficult because you have to, your premiums of course go up. Typically, you also discover you need more liability coverage than, say, the 1 million you might have started with. And often you don't have coverage for getting the data back if in fact it was lost. The insurance company will only help you up to a point in terms of if you can get it back, but they really won't make any additional effort to recover data for you. So again, if you don't have backups, or if you do pay out a ransom and you do recover your data, they aren't necessarily going to help you restore that data. It's going to be left up to you or your provider. And additionally, the insurance companies are the first call that you make for the investigation to start. That's actually the process. So you don't call your legal team, you don't call your IT provider, you call your insurance company, and they take over the investigation from day zero, essentially. Even if you've hired a incident response company, you start with the insurer. So reinsurance is really difficult. You still will have to prove down the road that you did institute the security changes and controls that were required. If you were breached the first time, your premiums will go up. But I just wanted to be super, super clear. Access control, identity management is core, but MFA is actually a requirement in order to be eligible for cyber insurance.
Good. Thank you, Carla. There is one question sort of related to the total identity security license and dark web monitoring offer. How can it be purchased? Yeah.
All right, so I'm really excited. Later this month, the product will be available globally. So as I mentioned, I have a two-tiered model. We have a distributor model, and then we have our managed service providers. So you will be hearing about this news very, very, very soon. So I don't want to preemptively announce anything, but it will become available in a very short number of weeks. Today, you can actually beta the product. So if you're already a WatchGuard customer or MSP provider, you can beta the product today. And as soon as we convert to a general availability, you'll be able to self-service trials on WatchGuard Cloud. And then you'll also be able to self-service trials today for our AuthPoint MFA product. So you can get started today trying the product as well as trying our MFA product. You just need to work with a managed service provider or be a managed service provider.
Awesome. Let's see, we still have quite a few questions. I don't know that we'll have time to address them all, but we can always follow up after the webinar. Do you have time for one more, Carla?
Let's take one more.
One more. So there was one about ThreadSync. Does ThreadSync work with Azure AD?
So it does. It's not that it's a direct connection line, because what you end up doing with anything related to Azure Active Directory is you're using those directory objects, users, groups, resources that are available there through something called the MS Graph API. So it does have the information associated to it when you sync it into WatchGuard Cloud Services, and then it can take advantage of the fact of what that information is, but it's not necessarily touching your directory. You don't want anything to touch your directory. So there's definitely, it's a more of a sync situation where we're ingesting the data, so like a copy, that's the easiest way to say, and not essentially touching that authoritative source. But yeah, it's the entire WatchGuard Cloud set of services. Every single one of the services works with Azure Active Directory in some capacity from a user perspective, and groups, devices, things that are registered as objects in the schema.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I think that was the last question we'll take, and we'll address everything else post-webinar.
Sounds great. I just remind everyone, click that QR code to download our white paper, and you're welcome to use it in campaigns. You're welcome to share it with customers. You're welcome to email it around and read it.
Thank you so much, Carla. So we are going to end the webinar, but rest assured the recording of this will be sent to you in the following days, and the presentation will also be shared. So if you don't have the chance to get to this white paper now, you will have the opportunity once we get you the presentation and recording. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.